Hey guys, welcome back. TJ here with Dead History, and welcome back to our second part of our Declaration of Independence Signer series, taking a look at the man from the state of Georgia, Button Gwinnett. I hope you enjoyed part one yesterday, taking a look at the early life and then his emigration here to America, to what would later become the United States, of course. We learned that Button Gwinnett was born over there in England and then emigrated to probably, from at least what we can gather from a couple sources, that Savannah, Georgia area. Maybe he came to Charleston, South Carolina, and then eventually moved on to Savannah, Georgia, but, you know, it's all kind of relevant and similar anyway. So, what else is there? So I am flying solo here today for part two here of the audio. Henry is not with me. And today is going to be a little bit interesting because we're going to discuss, obviously, Button Gwinnett from about the time of roughly 1775 on. And then, of course, we're going to discuss the very interesting death of Button Gwinnett. But then we have some very cool and very interesting bonus footage today. So I'm very excited for it. So let's just jump right in and get going and learn more about the signer from the state of Georgia, Button Gwinnett. Here we go. On September 13th of 1775, subsequent to an August recess, the Georgia delegates were seated in Congress after not having officially sent representatives to the First Continental Congress. However, Button Gwinnett was not yet selected. The Continental Congress's journal notes the admittance of Archibald Bullock, John Houston, Esquires, the Reverend John J. Zubley, Noble Wimberly Jones, and Lyman Hall. On January 7th of 1776, the royal governor of Georgia, James Wright, while in conversation with the Council of Safety in Savannah, was arrested by a group of patriots under Major, later Colonel, Joseph Habersham. The governor later escaped on February 11th and found refuge on a British warship on the Tybee River. Meanwhile, on the 11th of January, Colonel Lachlan Mcintosh was ordered by the council to prepare to defend Savannah in the event of a British invasion by sea or by the British forces in East Florida. By that time, Mcintosh was having problems with Button Gwinnett, the latter not having received a high command in the militia. On February 2nd of 1776, the Georgia delegates to the Second Continental Congress were selected by the Provincial Congress, and Button Gwinnett, among the group, took his seat on May 20th. Another of the delegation, a holdover from the previous year, the Reverend Zubley, at the last minute, after having switched his allegiance to the British, was exposed. He fled from Congress, chased by John Houston, who had been charged by Congress to give pursuit and to seize Zubley. Consequently, Houston, who supported the Declaration, missed the vote. So reading from another source here, this says that the government in Georgia and the rest of the American colonies at the time mirrored the two-party system inherited from the English Parliament, the Tories and the Whigs, but this would soon to change. The political spectrum of the age could not in any way be described as democratic, with a vast percentage of the population disenfranchised by sex, color, a lack of money, land, or standing, or a combination of all five. So it just kind of goes on to tell about what the scene was like in 1775, 1776 time frame. And it goes on to say how, like, the battles of Lexington and Concord and other, battles at the outbreak and start of the war, the fact that these engagements were seen as victories kind of probably had an effect on those waverers like Button Gwinnett, who had been hedging their bets knowing that the British troops were just superior as far as military to the Americans, and therefore the rebellion might fail. So although many were initially reluctant to join the rebel cause, the successes at Lexington and Concord must have persuaded them that it was either time to throw in their lot with the secessionists or go. Button Gwinnett decided to stay and throw his political weight, such as it was, wholeheartedly behind secession. As a major landowner, Button Gwinnett should have been acceptable to either main party, but he realized that he was seen as, kind of like somebody, he was old money, and he was a failed tradesman to boot, and that to succeed politically, he would have to be radical. So in these times, being radical meant being a secessionist. It basically meant, seceding from Britain. This may have persuaded him to become elected as a council member for the St. John's Parish, which at that time was standing in opposition to the Savannah and Christchurch faction of the Tory party. Lyman Hall, a fellow Declaration signer and friend, assessed Button Gwinnett as being, if possible, a Whig to an excess. What is certain is that once his ambivalence had disappeared, his ambition to gain social status and his commercial failure as a trader and farmer were the catalysts for his change of career to politician, perhaps assisted by his financial hardships. And the opinion stated in this excerpt from the Magazine of American History is absolutely correct. Button Gwinnett had long taken a deep interest in the welfare of the colonies, but he despaired of a successful resistance to Great Britain. His sentiments on this point, however, underwent a great change, and he became a warm advocate for opposing the unjust exactions of the mother country. Button Gwinnett had been prepared to bide his time to see whether Georgia would stay loyal to the crown or become one of the rebelling colonies. Once he saw which way the state was going to turn, he rapidly became a patriot and started to explore the various radical movements which were being formed outside of the main parties to encourage the split from the crown. Because he was British, he had to show that he was genuinely for the revolution. But nevertheless, he seemed to have been of the opinion that as a move to independence, either by negotiation or through force of arms, was inevitable. It would be better to take the political rather than the radical route, many followers of which advocated armed insurrection. It goes on to say that local radical rebels were active, and in 1775, local Savannah revolutionaries took the fight to the British. On May 11th of 1775, Major Habersham and other members of the Council of Safety raided the Royal Magazine in Savannah and made off with 600 pounds of powder, while on the 10th of July, another party, again under Major Habersham, assisted by Captain Bowen, seized a British schooner and took 1,400 pounds of powder. It is not known whether Button Gwinnett was a party to these operations, but it is more than likely that he knew about the radicals, since they appear to have been carried out by members of the Council of Safety, who were all prominent citizens, and he might not have been involved himself, but he would have sympathized with their motives and given tacit approval. The source I'm reading from goes on to say that Georgia decided to secede and obviously become part of one of the rebelling colonies. And that kind of goes through 1775, July of 1775, and it's kind of just going through all of these different scenarios and things that happen. Nothing that I'm going to get too deep into because we kind of touched on it a bit. Button Gwinnett was active politically at this time. This is around summer or early fall of 1775. And he was trying to persuade those wavering Tories to transfer their allegiance to the Whigs, as the views and interests of Tory power base in Savannah and Christchurch Parish were different to those of the rest of the state of Georgia, who were largely Whig sympathizers. Button Gwinnett saw an opportunity to break the hold of the entrenched Tories for once and for all by promising a more open political system, encouraging participation by the average Georgian, and deflecting power from the historic minority government to the majority. I think it's Georgian. I said Georgian, of course. By doing so, when he did this, when Button Gwinnett did, encourage participation by the average Georgian and deflected power, by doing this, he basically elevated himself to be a political force in the state and a de facto leader of the new Popular Party. The Georgia Gazette, on February 7th of 1776, states that the petition from the Congress of this province to the King was presented to His Majesty by Governor Johnstone on November 3rd last. And there follows a list of military appointments, including that of Lachlan Mcintosh, Esquire, as colonel of the battalion to be raised for the protection and defense of this province. The election of Lachlan Mcintosh to command of the Continental Battalion was not the simple process at this announcement implies, but one fraught with political wheeling and dealing, as the election for these various positions in January of 1776 was the first real test for the Popular Party. The Continental Congress had authorized the raising of a battalion with the commander selected by the legislature. The Christchurch Coalition, realizing the importance both militarily and politically of this position, nominated Samuel Elbert, an experienced militia officer, for the post. But the Popular Party, equally aware of the prestige of the appointment, decided to fight the selection and nominated Button Gwinnett. Obviously a political ruse, as Button Gwinnett had no military experience whatsoever. So yeah, this selection really would not sit well with the Tories, who were beginning to be suspicious of Button Gwinnett's motives and methods. Not only, was he not any sort of military man, he had no military experience, but being the fact that he was British, he wasn't a Brit who was born over in Britain, they kind of were like, what's this guy's motives? Like, is he really on our side type thing? So there was a lot of uncertainty when it came to this selection of Button Gwinnett. A compromise was therefore struck in that Button Gwinnett withdrew to join his friend Dr. Lyman Hall as a delegate to the Continental Congress. Elbert was appointed lieutenant colonel of the state militia battalion, and Lachlan Mcintosh, a plantation owner, member of a prominent Georgian family and a political neutral, was appointed as colonel in command of the Continental Infantry Battalion. Mcintosh came from a military family and had military experience. This and his neutral political credentials made him a suitable choice for the key military Continental Command within the state. Button Gwinnett's appointment to the Continental Congress was announced in the same edition of the Georgia Gazette, which continues, "On Friday last our provincial Congress proceeded to the election of delegates to represent this province in the Grand Continental Congress. When declaring the poll, it appeared that Archibald Bullock, John Houston, Lyman Hall, Button Gwinnett, and George Walton Esquires duly elected and declared delegates accordingly. The Congress also elected Archibald Bullock as president and commander-in-chief of the militia. It is not known whether this list of appointments was ever actually presented to the king, nor what position Governor Johnstone actually held. He may have been a lieutenant or deputy governor, as Wright was the royal governor at the time. However, the fact that the petition had been presented by the provincial congress to the king through the governor on paper at least shows that there remained a vestige of loyalty to the crown. But even if the petition had been presented, it is unlikely a reply would have been received, as the royal governor Sir James Wright was to be arrested and deported within the month. On May 20th of 1776, Button Gwinnett and his two colleagues, Lyman Hall and George Walton, presented their credentials to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. John Huston, selected at the same time as the other three, did not attend. During his stay in Philadelphia, Button Gwinnett continued to receive reports of the situation in his home state, and he determined that he should be the one with the capability to lead the state legislature once his work in Philadelphia was finished. For the present, however, Button Gwinnett had much to do for the Continental Congress, as he had been appointed to serve on at least two committees, one of which was charged with studying plans for a confederation of the states. The other was the Marine Committee, and we know this because Button Gwinnett is a signatory on a letter written from the committee on July 12th of 1776 to John Ashmead, informing that his request to join an expedition was not approved and that he was to return to his duties. Alongside Button Gwinnett, there were other signers on the Marine Committee who all appended their signatures to this letter. Bob Morris of Pennsylvania, P. Lewis, or might be Francis Lewis, of New York, George Reed of Delaware, and Arthur Middleton of South Carolina. The letter was written with the approval of John Hancock as President of Congress, and it is surprising that such an august body of men, with greater affairs of state of their minds, should have bothered themselves with such a request, which to all intents and purposes appears trivial. But such is the way of government business. Apart from this committee work, which from this example appears pretty mundane, Button Gwinnett and his Georgia colleagues had a more important agenda to achieve, which was set out in the letter Archibald Bullock had given them. The letter that Bullock gave them shows the concern felt by the state Congress about their inability to consolidate and defend the state boundaries against marauding Indians and loyalists from St. Augustine in Florida. The Tories of the Christ Church Coalition found themselves unable to provide Lachlan Mcintosh with the men and materials he required to coordinate the defense of the southern part of the state against these raids. And as a result, Bullock believed that the only way to achieve the necessary security was to task the delegates to pursue the Continental Congress for financial and military assistance. To gain agreement to this proposal from the Continental Congress was a major state aim, and in securing an appropriation of $60,000 for the defense of Georgia, the three delegates achieved a notable success. Button Gwinnett was not slow to assume responsibility for this, and possibly even overplayed his part, as he realized that it would help his political position when he returned to Savannah, Georgia. He also favored the Continental Congress taking responsibility for the regulation of Indian affairs and trade, if only so that the Continental Congress, rather than the state, could pay for it. This reflected his and the state Congress's concern about Georgia's frontier defenses. By making the Continental Congress responsible for Indian affairs, he must have hoped that the state would be able to request even more money from Congress when it was required for defense. The most important outcome from the delegates' attendance at the Continental Congress took place on July 2nd of 1776, when Button Gwinnett and his colleagues voted to accept the resolution calling for separation and signed the draft on the 4th of July. August 2nd Button Gwinnett was the second signatory on the final copy, and he left Philadelphia soon after the signing. Yeah, another source I read said he signed the famous parchment copy on August 2nd of 1776. Various sources suggest that he made the 700-mile journey back to Savannah in fast time, but such comments have to be tempered with the knowledge that there were only two practical methods of travel, by sea or on horseback. Both had their problems. A sea trip was totally dependent on tides, currents, and the wind, and even with all three in the traveler's favor, a ship of the day would be lucky to make much more than an average speed of 4 knots. On horseback, it would have taken at least 8, but more likely an uncomfortable 10 or 12 days riding, but only as long as there were readily available changes in route and the animals and the riders were fit. Button Gwinnett, with his aspirations to be a gentleman, is unlikely to have been fit enough to undertake a fast ride over such a distance, so even with an average speed of 10 miles an hour and a riding day of, say, 15 hours, the journey would have taken the best part of a week. And that's without the hazards ranging from a horse throwing a shoe to attacks by Indians and bandits and the overriding need to avoid British troops. There were equal dangers in returning by sea, as well as the risk of shipwreck or stranding. The Royal Navy had mounted a very tight blockade on the eastern seaboard in an effort to throttle any trade between the states and elsewhere. The warships, mostly corvettes and frigates, operated close inshore to allow them to seize provisions from coastal areas and also take water. So, would have been tough either way, no matter how you look at it. Button Gwinnett and the other two, if they were traveling with him, were by then known as signers and would have been seized and either imprisoned or put on trial. As a further inconvenience, if being inspected, and should the British warship be short of crew, suitable able-bodied seamen could be well pressed into service from the merchantmen. So they could have been seized and basically captured and put to work if they went by sea. Another source says Gwinnett supported the adoption of the Declaration of Independence, and on August 2nd, 1776, he placed his signature on the parchment document. Shortly thereafter, he completed his congressional work and returned to Georgia with a great expectation of becoming a commanding officer in the militia. But the appointment went to his political opponent, Lachlan Mcintosh. That October, Gwinnett was again selected as a representative of the Continental Congress. But he declined and instead became a member of the Georgia legislature. While in the legislature, he was involved with coming up with a blueprint for the state's constitution. But he also devoted time to work against his adversary, Lachlan Mcintosh. Another kind of cool thing I saw, that after signing the Declaration, Button Gwinnett was accompanied as far as Virginia by Carter Braxton, another one of the signers, carrying a proposed state constitution drawn up by John Adams. During his service in the Continental Congress, Button Gwinnett was a candidate for a brigadier general position to lead the 1st Regiment in the Continental Army, but he lost out to Lachlan Mcintosh, as we just heard. The loss of the position to his rival embittered Gwinnett greatly. Gwinnett served in the Georgia State Legislature, and in 1777 he wrote the original draft of Georgia's first state constitution. He became Speaker of the Georgia Assembly, a position he held until the death of the President-Governor of Georgia, Archibald Bullock. Button Gwinnett was elevated to the vacated position by the Assembly's Executive Council. In this position, he sought to undermine the leadership of Lachlan Mcintosh. And then we'll kind of get into that, but tensions between Button Gwinnett and Mcintosh reached a boiling point when the General Assembly voted to approve Button Gwinnett's attack on British Florida in April of 1777. So we're going to get into that even further here, but pretty interesting stuff about once Gwinnett got back to Georgia, what takes place and then leads up to his death. So here we go. As Button Gwinnett rode or sailed back to Savannah from Philadelphia, it must have concerned him that he was a target of opportunity either for a British military patrol to capture or those friendly to the British to make a fast buck by ransom. Whatever his thoughts about this, as he returned to Savannah, Gwinnett must have been pleased and proud with the outcome at Philadelphia, and in particular the fact that this success could only enhance his own political standing, and perhaps with a little embellishment about his own part in the proceedings would allow him to reach the highest offices of the state. In this, he was to be proved correct. We do not know when he actually left Philadelphia, but it was certainly after July 12th when he signed the letter to John Ashmead, and he was still in Philadelphia on August 2nd when he signed the final version of the Declaration. He must have had a good and fairly rapid journey because he was back in Savannah, Georgia in time to present the findings on August 30th and would probably have needed a few days to get his thoughts and political plans in order. He had, after all, been a member of a very successful Georgia team at the Continental Congress. Not only had the three of them participated in the preparation of the draft declaration and signed it, but they had also achieved success in obtaining the necessary funding for defense of the state, which was a considerable coup. So then it goes on to kind of talk about how a lot of things were happening, like late August 1776, the Council of Safety that Button Gwinnett had kind of been a part of. Enlistments mentioned represented a potent force of militia troops. It was all about defending the state of Georgia's borders and making sure that they had, good enough militia and troops to be able to defend those borders. So it kind of really goes into that in more detail. I'm not going to go over all of that. And then it starts to speak about the first Florida expedition. In the south of the state of Georgia, the situation was beginning to become serious. From about 1775, loyalists from Georgia who did not wish to secede from England had begun to resettle in eastern Florida, a British stronghold. Some of them formed a loose-knit group of militia called Tonines. It's Tonyns'. So I don't know if it's Tonians or Tonins. Tonines? I guess it's Tonians. They were Florida Rangers, and they took their orders from the royal governor, Patrick Tonin, regularly raiding the southern part of Georgia. They kind of adopted a guerrilla style of warfare, which was extremely difficult to counter. So you could see how all this is like going on. Button Gwinnett's involved in all of this, and that kind of leads us up to the first Florida expedition. So as I said, first Florida expedition, all this other stuff, it basically leads us all the way up to 1777. And basically in the month of February 1777, a convention of citizens from Georgia was held in Savannah to frame a constitution for the future government of the state. Of this convention, Button Gwinnett was a member, and it is said to have furnished the outlines of that constitution. He did, Button Gwinnett did, which was subsequently adopted. And then shortly after the convention occurred, the death of, Mr. Bullock, the president of the provincial council, and then Button Gwinnett was immediately elevated to the president of the provincial council. Unfortunately, while he represented the colony in Congress, he was a competitor with Lachlan Mcintosh for the office of Brigadier General. We already kind of went over all this. And the success of Lachlan Mcintosh, it didn't sit well with Button Gwinnett. So, his ambition was disappointed in being naturally hasty in his temper and in his conclusions. Button Gwinnett seemed from this time to have regarded Mcintosh as a personal enemy. On becoming president of the Executive Council, Button Gwinnett adopted several expedients by which to mortify his adversary. Among these One was the assumption of great power over the Continental Army in Georgia, in consequence of which General McIntosh was treated with much disrespect by a part of his officers and soldiers. To humble his adversary even further, Button Gwinnett, in an expedition which he had projected against East Florida, again, Florida expedition, designed to command the Continental troops and the militia of Georgia himself, to the exclusion of Lachlan Mcintosh from the command even of his own brigade. But basically what happened was Button Gwinnett, since he was president of the council, it prevented him from proceeding at the head of the expedition destined against East Florida. The troops, therefore, were by his orders placed under the command of a subordinate officer of McIntosh's brigade. The expedition entirely failed. That was the first Florida expedition, and probably contributed to the failure of Button Gwinnett's election to the office of governor in May of 1777. This failure blasted the hopes of Button Gwinnett and brought his political career to a close. In the disappointment and mortification of his adversary, General Lachlan Mcintosh foolishly exulted. The animosity between these two distinguished men from this time continued to gather strength, till Button Gwinnett, unmindful of the high offices which he had held, of his obligations to society, and of his paramount obligations to the author of his being, presented a challenge to Lachlan Mcintosh. And we'll get into that here in a few minutes. And then on March 14th, just 10 days into his job as president, this is March 14th of 1777, president of the provincial Congress council there, Button Gwinnett was trying to organize the expedition. He received a parcel of letters from John Hancock, who was president of the Continental Congress, of course. This contained an intercepted letter from the East Florida Royal Governor, Patrick Tonin, stating that a loyalist, William Panton, had shipped a cargo of rice from Georgia with the help of a Mr. George McIntosh. So George McIntosh, not Lachlan. The governor went on to write that McIntosh was basically willing to be all of all the service in his power to the king and the Constitution. So the congressional recommendation from John Hancock was that in view of the circumstances and evidence, George McIntosh should be arrested, and this was implemented. Such action would have accorded with Button Gwinnett's opinion of what he had been told about the case. Upon investigation, it transpired that this incident had in fact occurred in May of 1776, 2 full years after the state had accepted and implemented the association ban on trade with Britain. So, with all that being said, George McIntosh eventually was taken to common jail, arrested. And this was an action which caused his brother, Lachlan Mcintosh, to denounce the president as a man seeking personal and political revenge. While this was possibly true, there can be little doubt that George McIntosh's action in trading with a known loyalist was treason, as the cargo ended up in English hands. So, then there's even more, animosity between Lachlan Mcintosh and Button Gwinnett over the arrest of George McIntosh. George McIntosh was later released by the order of the Council of Safety after a vote was taken at a meeting at which Button Gwinnett was not present. Lachlan Mcintosh's defense of his brother only served to suggest to the public that there might be more traitors within the Christ Church ranks. So, interestingly enough, then there was a second Florida expedition. Button Gwinnett continued in his efforts to organize the militia half of the expedition and met with General Howe a second time to request Continental troops. The answer was the same, and additionally, he also refused Button Gwinnett's request that Lachlan Mcintosh be transferred to another Continental post out of state. So then there was a second Florida expedition that took place. So, it was really, the outcome of the expedition was truly, it was a disgrace. There was public embarrassment over it. did not go well. The second expedition, that is, as well, the second Florida expedition. So just to kind of give you an overview again of what we're talking about, during March of 1777, Button Gwinnett became the acting governor or president of the Council of Safety of Georgia when he succeeded Archibald Bullock, who died. Button Gwinnett's term lasted only 2 months because Gwinnett was not reelected. Meanwhile, the animosity between him and Lachlan Mcintosh intensified, the latter being dismayed with Gwinnett's appointment as the president of the council. The legislature had, in the meantime, in February of 1777, adjourned after transferring authority to the Council of Safety. Button Gwinnett held the position that the civilian government had the authority to try military forces for offenses, while General McIntosh declared that only the military held that power and officers charged with offenses would be tried by court-martial. As president, the council authorized him to assemble the militia and initiate an expedition into Florida, which was the second Florida expedition, in conjunction with Congress's authorization of an invasion into Florida if feasible. On March 17th of 1777, Button Gwinnett, as president of the Council of Safety, ordered that George McIntosh, the brother of General Lachlan Mcintosh, be arrested on charges of treason. We just went over this about the rice and the trading. Meanwhile, Gwinnett was unable to raise a sufficient number of troops, which compelled him to seek assistance from the Continental Army, which in Georgia was commanded by McIntosh, who had received a commission in the Continental Service as Brigadier General. The militia under Button Gwinnett arrived at Sunbury on April 13th of 1777, followed the next day by the Continental contingent under McIntosh. On the 15th of April at Sunbury, the officers of the Continental Army refused to attend a war council called by Button Gwinnett. Shortly thereafter, on the 17th of April, elements of the Continental Army prepared to move out of Sunbury, and at that time, Lachlan Mcintosh learned that Button Gwinnett ordered the militia not to advance. On May 1st of 1777, a contingent led by Colonel Samuel Elbert departed Sunbury en route to Florida, which was the second Florida expedition. Both Button Gwinnett and Brigadier General Lachlan Mcintosh had been recalled to Savannah, leaving Elbert in command of the expedition. Nevertheless, the mission failed. Gwinnett was charged with malfeasance, but he was subsequently cleared of any wrongdoing. However, the blood feud with McIntosh erupted into deadly violence when the two agreed to a duel. Yeah, we're going to get into that here in a minute. In May 1777, in Savannah, Georgia itself, the political process was degenerating from public acrimony into personal abuse. On the one hand, the Popular Party and Dr. Lyman Hall were supporting Button Gwinnett, and on the other hand, the Christ Church Coalition and the members of the old-style oligarchy under the other co-signer, George Walton, were supporting Lachlan Mcintosh. George Walton observed that Button Gwinnett was a man who made virtue subservient to his vices, and to cover the multitude of the latter, he affected to be in possession of the former. In early May 1777, the Assembly met to organize the government, and one of the initial requirements was to elect a new governor. Button Gwinnett had been appointed president for 3 months, but the strength of political opposition to him was such that there was a move to unseat him, preferably, as far as the Christ Church Coalition was concerned, as soon as possible. As a result, much to Gwinnett's disappointment, a de facto coalition elected John Truthlin, a political moderate, as the first governor of the state on May 8th. On hearing the news, Lachlan Mcintosh is reputed to have said, "I am glad." Lachlan Mcintosh was outraged with basically everything, discontent and contempt he felt for Button Gwinnett as a result of Gwinnett's accusations about McIntosh's family. They were exasperated. Now that he, a Continental Army officer, stood accused of professional incompetence by a politician whose party had little or no military credibility. This was after the Florida expedition debacles and failures. Lachlan Mcintosh decided to stand his ground and take issue with his nemesis for once and for all. On May 14th, 1777, and in front of all the members of the assembly, Lachlan Mcintosh denounced Gwinnett as a scoundrel and a lying rascal. Gwinnett felt he could not accept this insult, made it as it was public and in front of his peers on the floor of the House. So that evening, he challenged Lachlan Mcintosh in writing to a duel to be held the following morning at Sir James Wright's field just off the Thunderbolt Road, a mile from Savannah. Another source says on the morning of May 16, 1777, the men met on the field on the Wright plantation, Sir James Wright, on the outskirts of Savannah. The two antagonists each fired and both were wounded. However, Gwinnett's wound to the leg became infected with gangrene. So I'm going to read a little bit more from... There's a couple different sources here, of course. They fought at the distance of only 12 feet. Both were severely wounded. The wound of Button Gwinnett proved mortal. And basically, obviously, he died. But we're going to get into really kind of the meat and potatoes of this right now. Pistols at dawn. Lachlan Mcintosh, his second Colonel Joseph Habersham, and Button Gwinnett, accompanied by George Wells and Dr. Lyman Hall, met just before sunrise. The formalities were observed, greetings made, and pistols loaded. After discussion between the seconds as advised by their principals, the duel was to be conducted at between 8 and 10 feet range, face to face. There was no standing back to back, and counting off the distance, both men knew this was a blood feud, and that at the end of it, one or other or both would be dead or severely injured. Button Gwinnett's shot hit Lachlan Mcintosh in the fleshy part of the thigh, but Mcintosh's ball smashed Button Gwinnett's leg just above the knee. Both men called for a second shot, but the seconds decided that honor had been satisfied, and after a ceremonial handshake, the adversaries left the field to have their wounds tended. Button Gwinnett died 3 years later on the morning of Monday, May 19th, after mortification, a combination of infection, trauma, and gangrene. This was a typical battlefield wound of the day, and most casualties died as a result. Button Gwinnett was no exception. The hot and humid climate allowed the wound to fester, and lack of medical knowledge would have made any successful treatment of such a serious wound virtually impossible. That day, or shortly thereafter, Dr. Lyman Hall, who had signed the Declaration of Independence immediately under the name of Button Gwinnett, and who had been his close friend and supporter, wrote to Roger Sherman, one of the signers from Connecticut, and he said as follows: "Here it was in assembly that the general called him, as 'tis said, a scoundrel and lying rascal. I confess I did not hear the words, not being so nigh the parties. A duel was the consequence, in which they were placed at 10 or 12 foot distance. Discharged the pistols nearly at the same time, each wounded in the thigh. Mr. Gwinnett's thigh broke so that he fell. On which 'tis said that general asked him if he chose to take another shot, was answered yes, if they would help him up, or words nearly the same. The seconds interposed. Mr. Gwinnett was brought in, the weather extremely hot, a mortification came on, he languished from that morning, Friday, till Monday morning following, and expired. O liberty, why do you suffer so many of your faithfuls, your warmest votaries to fall at your shrine. Alas, my friend, excuse me, Dr. Sir, the man was valuable. Attached to the liberty of this state and continent, that his whole attention, influence, and interest centered in it, and seemed riveted to it. He left a mournful widow and daughter, and I may say, the friends of liberty on a whole continent, to deplore his fall. It is right to spend a little time on the duel itself. It is apparent from contemporary accounts that the arrangements were agreed with some rancor and without the normal niceties, if such a word can be applied to an occasion where one or two people set out to kill each other over a matter of principle. The distance between the protagonists was shorter than normal, and the duel was conducted face to face without the normal pacing and turning before firing. Under such circumstances, it would take a lot of guts to aim and fire one's pistol in the full knowledge that the chap at the other end was doing the same thing, and the temptation would be to hurry the process to get the shot off first. Firing a flintlock pistol is not easy. They are heavy weapons, not very well balanced, and not particularly accurate. When charged and primed, care has to be taken not point the barrel downwards, as there is a risk the ball could roll out. Once on aim with the arm extended, the gun feels heavy, but the aim has to be maintained for anything up to 2 seconds after the trigger has been pulled to allow the mechanism to spring forward, the flint to ignite the powder train, and fire the charge in the barrel. Not easy when looking down the barrel of the opponent's gun a mere 10 feet away, knowing that the same thought process is going through his mind as well. The protocol in duels was often to aim for a flesh wound rather than an injury likely to maim or kill. In many cases, after the first round had been fired, the opponent fired his gun into the air to signify that honor had been satisfied. In the case of this duel, that did not happen. We will never know whether Button Gwinnett was trying to follow the protocol of giving a flesh wound, or if he was just a bad shot and nearly missed. It does seem likely that Lachlan Mcintosh, as an experienced and better shot, could have aimed at the chest, but if he had killed Button Gwinnett with such a shot, he would have stood trial for murder. The fact that he hit Button Gwinnett in the leg shows that he probably intended to give a suitably serious wound, but that he was not intending that Button Gwinnett should die, only that he should be taught a lesson. Lachlan Mcintosh wrote to Colonel John Lawrence, the military secretary to George Washington, giving his version of events and justifying his actions. It is likely that at this stage in the Revolutionary War, George Washington had more important things to worry about other than a spat between two local politicians, and he does not seem to have reacted until forced to do so by events. Locally, however, Mcintosh's defense was not accepted by the civil authorities in Savannah, and once it was brought to their attention by Dr. Lyman Hall that the law officers had taken no cognizance of the duel, Mcintosh was indicted, tried, and acquitted on a charge of murder. The Army realized, however, that Mcintosh's position in Georgia was militarily, politically, and socially untenable as commander of the Continental Brigade, a state politician, and as a citizen, so George Washington arranged for him to be appointed to another Continental Army post out of state. General Mcintosh is called to the northward, which I am very glad of, both for his own and state's sake. 'Twas impossible for him to have or give any satisfaction here. Prejudice was strong against him. Mcintosh went on to distinguish himself at Valley Forge under George Washington, who reported well upon him, and he returned to Georgia as second in command of American forces under Sam Elbert at the defense of Savannah in 1779. After further fighting and a temporary stay in Virginia, he eventually returned to Savannah in 1782, where he died in 1806. Several 19th century sources report that Button Gwinnett first arrived in South Carolina at Charleston during 1770 and remained there in business for 2 years prior to relocating in Georgia. However, the National Park Service reports that documentation showed that Gwinnett had acquired his business in Savannah, Georgia during 1765 and the same year acquired his plantation. And also some sources at times differ on the date of Gwinnett's death, with some stating May 19th of 1777 and others stating May 27th or some other date. The National Park Service, Department of the Interior, concurs that his death occurred several days after the duel. The same date is used by the Georgia Encyclopedia and the Biographical Directory of the U.S. Congress. After Button Gwinnett's death, Anne Gwinnett tried to sue the surgeon for failing to tend to the wound correctly, thereby letting her husband die. It is probable that lack of money prevented her from doing so, and even if she had managed to take the surgeon to court, it is unlikely that she would have won her case. She also wrote to Lachlan Mcintosh attaching no blame to him for her husband's death and wishing him well. On his death, Button Gwinnett left no money. His affairs were in disarray. His property, by some accounts, was to be totally destroyed in the British occupation of Savannah a year later. He was living in a house he did not own, on land he probably leased fraudulently, and his wife and daughter were in debt. There is record that almost immediately after his death, and in an effort to clear his most immediate debts, his household goods and slaves were sold and scattered in a public vendue in Sunbury. There is one reason why there are so few personal papers and letters. That's probably one of them. Gwinnett's will and probate is kept in the Chatham County Probate Records. A will is one thing. Having the necessary deeds and collateral to allow for probate is something else, and it is known from the advertisements in the Savannah and Charleston newspapers for the sale of slaves and furniture that it took Dr. Lyman Hall, his executor, some 4 years to finalize the details. There is a story that after Button Gwinnett's death, Anne and Betsy moved back to St. Catherine's Island and continued to live there and even inherited it. I tend to believe that a prolonged stay would have been unlikely. They may well have stayed on it for a short while, but the rapid sale of Gwinnett's effects, which presumably included the furniture, household, and probably slaves, would have meant that they would not have been able to live in the Tabby house. The lease belonged to Bossomworth, and their lack of money, not to mention continued hounding by creditors for repayment of Button Gwinnett's debts, means that they would have been unable to pay any rent or buy the lease back. It is much more plausible that they moved to Charlestown soon after the death. Betsy married Peter Bellin in Charlestown on March 26, 1779, but died 6 years later. Peter Bellin and both of his parents came from South Carolina. There are various references to him between 1779 and 1792, and he administered Betsy's estate in February 1785, but there's no record of his death. Like many other records, it might have been lost in the siege of Charleston during the American Civil War. There are claims that he and Betsy had children, but that they had died young. On November 3rd of 1824, an advertisement was placed in the Savannah Daily Georgian from the Hope Insurance Office in New York City, seeking heirs of Anne Gwinnett, afterwards Bellin, I should say. But it is not known if any came forward. Anne Gwinnett died sometime after 1781, when the probate of Button Gwinnett's will was finalized, and before May 4th, 1785, when her own will was probated. Reading another excerpt from a source about Button Gwinnett's death in the duel. Thus fell one of the patriots of the Revolution, and though entitled to the gratitude of his country for the services which he rendered her, her citizens will ever lament that he fell a victim to a false ambition and to a false sense of honor. No circumstances could justify an action so criminal, none could ever palliate one so dishonorable. In his person, Button Gwinnett was tall and of noble and commanding appearance. In his temper, he was irritable, yet in his language he was mild, and in his manners polite and graceful. Happy, had it been for him, had his ambitions been tempered with more prudence, and probably happy for his country, had his political career not been terminated in the prime of his life. Historians perhaps find it hard to come to terms with the fact that Button Gwinnett managed to reach the pinnacle of state politics from an unpromising background with his history of financial ineptitude and no military or previous political experience. Whatever they may write about him, and there's not much that they have, they cannot deny that Button Gwinnett must have possessed personal qualities of presence, oratory, determination, and conviction, all of which he used to rise rapidly to leadership of his party and state in time of war. Unfortunately, his other quality, namely his intemperate rashness, brought about his ultimate demise. Maybe historians consider that his contribution was so meaningless as to not be worth a mention, and maybe they are correct. But it cannot be said that he did not make his mark on the politics of Georgia at the time. His greatest achievement must be the restructuring of the parish system in the implementation of a fairer electoral enfranchisement, which allowed many more to be able to take part in the political decision-making. Whatever his personal shortcomings and political mistakes might have been, his short and colorful career is unique in American history and deserves greater credit. He is a founding father. He is a signer of the Declaration of Independence. By being mortally shot and effectively disappearing from view, Button Gwinnett remains an enigmatic character of American political and folk history, so that his story continues to generate an aura of mystery to this day. Perhaps his memorial should have read, "An Englishman, failed merchant, failed plantation owner, bankrupt, and opportunist politician who became a signer and founding father, but overplayed his hand and got himself shot. A casualty of the American dream." I mean, we know, Button Gwinnett was a signer. He was a founding father. I mean, founding fathers of the U.S. were political leaders and statesmen who participated in the American Revolution by signing the Declaration of Independence, taking part in the American Revolutionary War, and establishing the U.S. Constitution. Gwinnett was certainly a signer, but he had, of course, died by the time the Constitution was drafted and framed. But the phrase founding fathers is generally applied to an American statesman of the Revolutionary period. And, Button Gwinnett definitely should be accepted as that, because he was that. There's no doubt. There's absolutely 100% no doubt. What did he look like? No one really knows what he looked like. A description by a Georgian historian, Hugh McCall, states that he was about 6 feet in height and his person was probably proportioned lofty and commanding. Without possessing remarkable eloquence, his language was mild and persuasive, his manners were polite, and his deportment graceful. But since McCall was born in 1767, he would have been 10 years old when Gwinnett died. So it really can't be an actual first-hand observation or description. There are 2 portraits, 2 drawings, and 1 bust of the same man, but each is slightly different. So it's kind of hard to really know exactly what he looked like. Who knows? It's kind of it's an interesting debate, but from all accounts, he was pretty tall. That's for sure. So now, just to take a quick look at the Tabby House, which is supposedly the Button Gwinnett House on St. Catherine's Island. It's a Georgia barrier island. It was built there. The home faces west, overlooking Walberg Creek. It's believed to have been lived in by Button Gwinnett. Some debate exists on the exact date the Gwinnett house was built, but it is believed the core of the tabby structure is at least 200 years old, and it is known that Button Gwinnett lived on the island from 1774 until his death in 1777. Now, there was some renovations done to it. I'm going to show you some pictures on the screen here. It's a private... St. Catherine's Island is privately owned by the nonprofit St. Catherine's Island Foundation. So it's all about like natural history and ecology and zoology and all this other stuff out there. The only way to access the island is by boat. So you can't, drive. There's no bridge or anything to get onto the island. The Gwinnett house is there, supposedly. It still stands to this day. But you can't, it's not like an open house where people can go and visit it. Because even if you take a boat out there to St. Catherine's Island, like I said, it's a private island. I think you could go along the beach there from what I've read. And I've only done a few, moments of research on St. Catherine's Island. But from what I've read, you can go like to the beach there. There's like a beachfront area, but you can't go anywhere else. Like you can't go to the house. There's no like, hey, you can have your car on the boat and you can boat and ship your car over there and then drive your car around the island. It's not like that. So the pictures I'm showing you are all stock photos. They're all either historic drawings or they're photos that were actually taken of the Gwinnett house. Some of these pictures are even inside of the Gwinnett house. But this was Button Gwinnett's house on St. Catherine's Island in Georgia. No, I've never been there, and I do not know anyone that has ever personally been there or seen this house in person. So, definitely pretty unique and rare, but I just definitely want to show you some of that, those pictures of the Gwinnett house, the Tabby house out there on St. Catherine's Island in Georgia. Pretty cool stuff about St. Catherine's Island. I mean, you can definitely look it up. Just Google the Button Gwinnett house on St. Catherine's Island. You can find some photos that I showed and maybe find some articles about it. I know there was one article I found and was like in a Savannah website, like a Savannah business website. Back in 2016, the historic Button Gwinnett house was getting a facelift. So, I mean, there's definitely been things done, renovations, facelifts to it. But yeah, so there you have it. Pretty cool stuff. And then, of course, his legacy. Like I said, Button Gwinnett's autograph is highly sought by collectors as a result of a combination of the desire by many top collectors to acquire a complete set of autographs by all 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence and the extreme rarity of the Gwinnett signature. There's actually only 51 known examples, since Button Gwinnett was fairly obscure prior to signing the Declaration, and he died shortly afterward. Only 10 of those 51 are in private hands of his autograph. So crazy. Gwinnett County, Georgia, a suburban area of Atlanta, is named after Button Gwinnett, and he is one of the 3 Georgia signers of the Declaration of Independence that is honored with the Signers Monument in Augusta, Georgia. Which you're actually probably seeing now on your screen. The Signers Monument there. I visited there in Augusta, Georgia. So there's those photos. Now we're going to get into, so we talked about his house out there on St. Catherine's Island, the Duel, all this interesting stuff. Now we have to talk about his gravesite, because this is cool. This is interesting stuff. Here we go. There is no record of Button Gwinnett's burial that survives, but there's no reason to doubt that he would have been interred at the Christ Church Cemetery, the only graveyard active in Savannah, Georgia at the time of his death. His exact burial place was lost by the mid-1840s, the first time anyone made any real effort to find it. And there is a rumor that the headstone ended up in use as a bar top at a Savannah grog shop. Now, if they'd known where Archibald Bullock's grave was, they may have been able to find Button Gwinnett's. Bullock held the office of president of Georgia until his death in February 1777, and at that time the office went to Button. We know that. When Gwinnett got himself shot 3 months later, it would be logical to bury him near his predecessor in office. Bullock's grave would not have been marked in the 1840s either, but in 1921 it was announced that a strange grave marked only with carvings of snakes, known as the rattlesnake grave or the serpent's tomb, had been identified as Bullock's. But no one figured out that it would be a good clue to where Button's gravesite for more than 30 years. So keep that in mind. Then in 1957, high school principal Arthur J. Funk looked near Bullock's gravestone. He found an unmarked grave that he suspected was Button Gwinnett, and he had it exhumed. Early reports on whether the skeleton he found was Button's were inconclusive, but Arthur Funk kept it in his guest room for 5 years before the city was ready to rebury it. Yes, the body of Button Gwinnett, 5 years in his guest room. A new monument identifies the grave as being the probable burial place of Button Gwinnett. Probable burial place. The cemetery itself, which is now known as Colonial Park, is a lovely place full of live oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. So, here we go. Keep in mind all this stuff that I'm telling you. So where is he? Local newspaper reports mention Button Gwinnett's funeral taking place in what is now the Old Colonial Cemetery in Savannah. Given the parlous state of his financial affairs, it is possible that the estate could not afford a headstone, but there were reports of a stone being found some years later with largely illegible writing, but for 2 sets of double T's, a double N, and a double 7. Although it might be a coincidence, this unique combination of letters and numbers on the stone, even if it were the lower half upon which a mason had practiced the cutting and spacing for the top half, would point to it being Button Gwinnett's grave marker, and be evidence that he was buried somewhere in the cemetery. Some say this stone was used as a bar table, but no one can discover any substance for that rumor. The cemetery suffered some damage during the Battle and Siege of Savannah in 1778 and 1779, and it is possible that Button Gwinnett's grave was one of those disturbed. On June 3rd of 1957, the U.S. publication Stars and Stripes published a story under the title 1776 Patriot's Grave Sought, which followed an Associated Press release that a grave presumed to be Gwinnett's had been opened in the Colonial Cemetery and that a thigh bone had been removed and was being examined. The story stated that identification concentrated on the fact that the body had a broken leg, which would tie in with the injury Gwinnett received in the duel. The story did not say which leg was being examined, nor did it say whether the leg was shattered or just broken. The impact of a ball shot on the thigh bone would have caused catastrophic injury, and even if the bone had not been shattered, the leg would probably have been amputated to stop the spread of gangrene. This report also mentioned the broken gravestone. The same paper ran a similar story, this time written by Bill Mahoney 2 months later on August 1st of 1957, to the effect that a thigh bone believed to be Gwinnett's was removed from Savannah's Colonial Cemetery this spring by Lewis Larson of the Georgia Historical Commission. Experts at the Smithsonian Institute, U.S. Museum and Laboratories of the FBI are checking the bone. The Stars and Stripes next covered Gwinnett on October 5th of 1964, when they published a story that the remains, which had been dug up in 1957, had been stowed in a small copper box, which had remained in the custody of Georgia State Representative Arthur J. Funk of Savannah and had been reburied the week before. There is nothing in the story to say what the outcome of the investigations had been. But this probably reflects the fact that the findings were inconclusive, as no one could bring forward any evidence to prove that the bones which had been exhumed were Button Gwinnett's. The story further reported that there had been some discussion between Savannah and Augusta about where Gwinnett's bones, if that is what they were, should be buried, as the remains of the other two signers, Dr. Lyman Hall and George Walton, are buried in Augusta, Georgia. Savannah objected to Gwinnett joining them, so a former mayor of Augusta, Millard A. Beecham, appealed to the Secretary of State of Georgia, Ben Fortson, to ask him to intercede on the grounds that it was only right that the three signers should be buried together like one happy family. The latter refused to get involved, but did approve an allocation of $5,000 to help Savannah fund a suitable memorial. The remains under the memorial are believed to have brown or reddish hair, but the color of Gwinnett's hair is unknown. The skeleton had a shattered or broken leg, which suggests, but does not prove, that it might be Gwinnett's, as his leg was probably amputated as a result of his injuries. Even if it was not, the bones would show severe damage from the gunshot wound. Unfortunately, it is not known exactly what treatment Gwinnett received for his injury. Possibly not much, as Ann Gwinnett tried to sue the surgeon after Gwinnett's death. Despite this uncertainty, and possibly because of a wish to use the $5,000 donated towards it, the memorial marker was placed in a prominent position in the cemetery without reference to any grave, and the inscription reads, "This memorial to Button Gwinnett, born 1735, died 1777, Georgia signer of the Declaration of Independence, President of Georgia, whose remains buried in this cemetery are believed to lie entombed hereunder, was erected by the Savannah-Chatham County Historic Site and Monument Commission with monies contributed by the state of Georgia, the city of Savannah, and the Georgia Societies of the Sons of the Revolution, Daughters of the American Revolution Society of Colonial Wars, and Colonial Dames of America." And just to confuse matters, there is some conjecture that the bones exhumed might have been female. If no one really knew where Gwinnett had been buried within the cemetery, it should not be a surprise that the wrong body might have been exhumed. The fact that the inscription is careful to say, "are believed to lie," confirms that without forensic or DNA evidence, we will never know whether the body in the grave under the memorial is Button Gwinnett's or somebody else. But as the contemporary newspaper reports state that he was buried in the cemetery, this is probably so, and the exact site of his grave is irrelevant. The fact that his memorial is in the right cemetery is what truly matters. So you will actually see from my photos and my bonus footage, you're going to see some old photos. You're actually going to see pictures of that old school principal exhuming the body. All sorts of cool photos that I found to show you guys. But you're going to see my photos. So the Colonial Park Cemetery in Savannah, when I was there, it was closed. It was 2020. It was during COVID. And I got there at like sunrise, probably 6:45 or so in the morning. And it was closed and I couldn't get in. It's gated all around. There was nowhere for me to like hop the gate, as fans of this channel know I've been known to do, to be completely honest. And it was June. It was like mid-June. I want to say it was probably around June 14th or so of 2020. So it's like summertime, basically. It's like 6:45, 7 a.m. It was not open. I could not get in. So you'll see it from my photos. The closest I got to his memorial and his supposed gravesite is probably about, I'd say it's about 50 yards. 50 to 60 yards away is probably as close as I got. You'll see a picture of me, and through the fence you can see Button Gwinnett's gravesite in the background. The up-close pictures that I'm going to show you, they're actually from Kurt Dion of Kurt's Historical Sites. Kurt was kind enough to share his Button Gwinnett gravesite photos with me, so pretty interesting stuff. But yeah, so I've been there, and I've been probably 50 yards away from it, and I've seen it with my own eyes, but I've never actually stood, right by it. And the funny thing is, who knows? Maybe I was closer to it than the memorial actually is. Maybe the memorial is not where his actual body is. Maybe that's somebody else's body, as the article I just read said. And so maybe I was even closer to his actual body than I even thought. Who knows, right? It's interesting facts. Now, in the bonus footage, there's going to be a couple of videos that I want to show you. These are cool little videos from local Georgia news stations. You'll probably find that fascinating. And there is a audio. I think I'm going to do this. Well, we'll see. I might include an audio. It's a podcast that this guy does. And it's pretty good. It's pretty fascinating, all about Button Gwinnett's gravesite. But it's like 20, 25 minutes long, so it would make this really long. But I'll put that in bonus footage, so if you don't want to obviously listen to that, you don't have to. But beside my gravesite photos, there is something really, really cool in the bonus footage that you have to stay tuned for, that I think you guys are going to love. So please stay tuned for that. So that's pretty much it, guys. That's a look at our very first Georgia signer from the state of Georgia, Button Gwinnett, here doing our Declaration of Independence signer series. Button Gwinnett from the state of Georgia. Pretty cool stuff. And then, of course, next week, we're going to keep going on. Like I said, we're doing this in order of states. So the next person that we're going to do after Button Gwinnett is actually going to be Lyman Hall. I believe it's Lyman Hall. Let me just double check and make sure I got it right. I think he's the one that signed underneath Button Gwinnett. Yep, it is. It's Lyman Hall. Lyman Hall is next, and then after that will be George Walton. So next week, Georgia signer Lyman Hall. I hope you enjoyed this look at Button Gwinnett, his fascinating, interesting life. I know part 2 here is a little long, but I hope you enjoyed it. I wanted to give you some good context about somebody who led, I should say, kind of a very obscure life. We don't hear much ever about Button Gwinnett, so I hope I kind of taught you guys, and maybe you learned a little something about this obscure founding father and signer of the Declaration of Independence. Thanks so much for everything, guys. Keep the subscribes coming, the likes, the thumbs up, the comments, the questions. I love it. And please stay tuned for the bonus footage. I really think you're going to enjoy what I have to show you. I hope you do. Looking forward to next week. Henry will be back with me. So we will see you then for our next installment. Thanks, guys. See you next week. Hey, guys. TJ here, of course, with Dead History. I wanted to just do this audio real quick just to explain what you're going to be seeing. So, when I was doing my research on Button Gwinnett, I actually found someone from the Georgia Historical Society by the name of Stan Deaton. Stan is a distinguished historian. He obviously works for the Georgia Historical Society. And I found, which you're going to see here in a minute, I actually found 2 video clips of Stan Deaton talking about Button Gwinnett. You're going to see those clips here very shortly. So when I found those clips online and I found the information about Stan Deaton from the Georgia Historical Society, I reached out to Stan. I emailed him, hoping to do a Zoom interview with him. Some of you will remember from past series I've done that sometimes I'll get historians and authors to jump on a Zoom interview with me, and I'll include that in my video. Unfortunately, Stan was not available right now, but he was very gracious, and he wrote me back and was very nice, and he gave me an amazing opportunity. he gave me the email and the contact information for Colin Gwinnett Sharp. Colin Gwinnett Sharp is a descendant of Button Gwinnett's, and he is an author of pretty much the only book out there on Button Gwinnett. It's called Button Gwinnett, Failed Merchant, Plantation Owner, Mountebank, Opportunist Politician, and Founding Father. That's the name of the book that Colin Gwinnett Sharp wrote and authored. So, as you could probably already guess, I contacted and emailed Colin Gwinnett Sharp, and Colin was very gracious. Colin lives over in the UK. He lives in England. He's an Englishman. So he was very gracious and very kind to call me via a phone call, and him and I had a discussion, an interview, if you will, about Button Gwinnett. So the next two clips you're going to see are the video clips of Stan Deaton from the Georgia Historical Society. You're going to see those clips. You'll find that interesting. And then what I'm going to play after that is the phone interview that I conducted with Colin Gwinnett Sharp, all about Button Gwinnett. Now, the audio is a little low on that phone interview. I do apologize for that. What I can suggest to everyone is turn your volume way up, or even maybe go get a pair of headphones if you have them, or earphones, and plug them in and listen to that audio portion. It's fascinating. It's so awesome. I loved it. It was great to talk to Colin. I cannot thank Colin enough. I'll be putting his information for his book on the screen when the audio is playing, so go check it out. And then, of course, you're going to see the photos of my kind of brief, not exactly visit to Button Gwinnett's gravesite. You'll see those photos because I couldn't get into the cemetery. It was closed. And then you're going to see a couple photos of the gravesite that were stock photos, and also from Kurt Dion of Kurt's Historic Sites shared his Button Gwinnett gravesite photos with me. So you'll see those as well. So enjoy, guys. That's the big surprise. A phone interview with Colin Gwinnett Sharp, author of the only Button Gwinnett book pretty much out there, and a descendant of Button Gwinnett. So enjoy. Thanks so much, guys.
Halloween is good for scary stories and tall tales, but the bizarre history of one of Georgia's best-known political figures, it's all true. 11 Alive's Doug Richards explores the brief life and curious death of Button Gwinnett.
We know him by the county that bears his name, a man named Button Gwinnett, remembered forever for his signature on the Declaration of Independence. It was the high point of an ambitious yet often troubled life.
And he failed at everything he tried to do. He tried the mercantile business, he tried to become a planter on St. Catherine's Island, and he was never any good at it. And
Stan Deaton is a Button Gwinnett scholar.
I think he had military ambitions based upon what? Nobody knows. He never had any military skill as far as we know, or any other kind, really. I think he had a skill of getting himself elected to offices during times of turbulence.
Was Button Gwinnett kind of a crackpot?
Button Gwinnett was a crackpot.
For a few months, the Georgia legislature made Button Gwinnett governor of the newly formed state. That's where he crossed swords with and made an enemy of an actual military man named Lachlan Mcintosh. Mcintosh took their dispute public.
He was just convinced that Gwinnett was really a corrupt guy, and he called him out on the floor of the state legislature. He stood up and said that he was a scoundrel and a lying rascal.
Was Mcintosh correct when he called Gwinnett a scoundrel?
A scoundrel and a lying rascal? Probably, yeah.
And that led Gwinnett and Mcintosh to a pasture on the outskirts of Savannah, where Gwinnett had challenged Mcintosh to a duel. Do you know which one fired the fatal shot?
We do not know.
The purported dueling pistols
They've been well preserved, haven't they?
are preserved at the Georgia Historical Society in Savannah. The duel, like much of Button Gwinnett's life, was nasty, brutish, and short.
He died on Monday, May 19th, 1777. The duel took place on Friday. He died on Monday. He lingered over a weekend, which must have been an agony without, modern medical care. And he was buried pretty hastily.
Deaton says Gwinnett is likely buried in Savannah's historic Colonial Park Cemetery. There's a modern-day marker for Gwinnett, but he says history kind of lost track of Gwinnett's actual burial site.
There was a rumor that at one point his gravestone wound up at a bar somewhere as a bar top. Somehow or other, he disappeared. His gravestone disappeared, and no one thought enough of him. This should give us some idea. No one at that time thought enough of him to replace it, to build a monument over his grave. It just went away.
Meantime, Lachlan Mcintosh, the man who fired the fatal shot, got a promotion. He went on to become a Continental Army general and served alongside George Washington. McIntosh's actual gravesite is memorialized in the same colonial cemetery. The city of Savannah named a boulevard for McIntosh, and the state of Georgia named a county after the man who slew Gwinnett. Is that Mr. Gwinnett's bones?
They're supposedly bones and hair that came out of that grave.
Gwinnett's remains, if that's what they are now a historical curiosity at best. Even his portrait is based on recollections and guesswork. Button Gwinnett's signature is his most tangible legacy. Because his life was so short, his autograph among collectors is one of the most valuable in the world.
He's an enigma.
In Savannah, Doug Richards, 11 Alive News.
Hey, Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Welcome back. We've all heard of the famous Alexander Hamilton-Aaron Burr duel of 1804, but 27 years earlier, right here in Georgia, there was another famous duel involving a signer of the Declaration of Independence. I'm talking, of course, about Button Gwinnett. Gwinnett first came to Savannah in 1765 at the age of 30. He was a native of England, and as one historian said, Gwinnett always had the ability to rob Peter to pay Paul. He came here, borrowed money, set himself up as a merchant, failed at that, borrowed enough money to buy St. Catherine's Island, and failed as a planner. It was the American Revolution that propelled him to fame and glory. He got himself elected to the Second Continental Congress in 1776, went to Philadelphia and voted in favor of independence on July 4th, and signed the famous document, the Declaration, on August 2nd. Now, the other two signers were Dr. Lyman Hall and George Walton. Gwinnett came back to Savannah and got himself embroiled in partisan bickering and fighting, most famously with the family of Lachlan Mcintosh. In May of 1777, on the floor of the General Assembly, Mcintosh called Gwinnett a scoundrel and a lying rascal. Gwinnett challenged him to a duel, and the next day, in the morning, May 16th, they met in a pasture of Governor James Wright's, one of his plantations east of town. They both shot each other in the leg, but Gwinnett's wound proved fatal. Gangrene set in, and on the morning of May 19th, 1777, Gwinnett died. He was buried that evening in what was then called Christ Church Cemetery, now called Colonial Park Cemetery. Now, fast forward 70 years, in 1848, the city of Augusta erected a signer's monument and relocated the bones of Hall and Walton to Augusta, but they couldn't find Gwinnett's grave because sometime in the intervening 70 years, his gravestone had disappeared and no one thought it important enough to replace. Fast forward another 100 years. In the 1950s, a retired Savannah principal named Arthur Funk, who had always been interested in Gwinnett, got permission from the city to start digging around in Colonial Park Cemetery. And near the grave of Archibald Bullock, he found a body of an 18th century person and assumed and pronounced that it was Button Gwinnett. Now, there were no conclusive tests. In fact, tests at the Smithsonian Institution confirmed that it probably wasn't Gwinnett. But nevertheless, in 1964, to much pomp and ceremony, the bones of Button Gwinnett, or whoever they were reburied in Colonial Park Cemetery. And if you go there today, you will see the monument they erected to Button Gwinnett. No one knows for sure that it's him. Now, Gwinnett's signature proved to be the rarest of all the signers of the Declaration, because he had not been prominent before the Revolution, and the documents that he signed were for the most part not saved. He lived less than a year after he signed the Declaration, so his signature has gone for auction well over $250,000. Now, one of the great prized artifacts in the Georgia Historical Society collection are the dueling pistols used by Button Gwinnett and Lachlan Mcintosh 243 years ago. In 1818, Georgia honored Gwinnett with Gwinnett County, where I grew up. I graduated from South Gwinnett High School. Surprisingly enough, there has not been a lot written about Gwinnett because the documents are scarce. One of the best books is written by a friend of mine who is also a descendant of Button Gwinnett. His name is Colin Gwinnett Sharp, and you can find his book titled Button Gwinnett on Amazon. Now, we think we live in partisan times today, and we do, highly driven by faction and political bickering. But Button Gwinnett's death 243 years ago, this weekend, is a reminder that our political parties today, driven by faction though they may be, are there to institutionalize our political differences so that we don't go out and shoot each other in duels. Remember Mr. Gwinnett this weekend. Stay safe, stay strong. I'm Stan Deaton with the Georgia Historical Society. Thank you for watching.
Hi there, it's Colin Sharp.
Hi, Colin. How are you, sir?
Very well, thanks.
So, I got your information from that gentleman from the Georgia Historical Society over here in the States, and I was quite fascinated because I actually purchased your book on Amazon, and I was reading it.
Well, thanks very much for that.
Of course, absolutely. It's quite fascinating. So, if you don't mind me asking, I kind of obviously read, but I'm going to probably include this audio of our conversation in my Button Gwinnett video. So, if you don't mind kind of just explaining, how are you a descendant of Mr. Gwinnett?
Well, that's a very good question. We know that we are descended, and basically the Sharp part of Gwinnett Sharp joined the family in about 1801. The problem is there are a lot of Gwinnetts in Gloucestershire in the late 17th, 18th century, but I've traced it all the way back to Gwinnett's grandfather.
Wow.
Because Gwinnett his father had two uncles, neither of whom had any children, and Gwinnett himself had no brothers who survived, and of course he had no sons. He only had the daughter who died quite soon after him.
Yes.
So basically, the route back goes further back and then comes forward.
Wow. Interesting. So, your book is fascinating because it's really the only book or document that we have even here in the States about Button, because as I'm sure you know from your research on him, there's just not a whole lot of information out there on Button Gwinnett.
Well, there's not a lot, because as you've probably read in the book, when he died, his affairs were in his financial affairs, and probably his paper affairs in a complete shambles.
Yeah.
And his belongings were scattered very quickly. In fact, there was an auction in Sunbury of his furniture and effects, and about 3 days of his death, all the papers got scattered. There are, I think, from memory, 52 bits of paper with his signature on.
Yeah.
A whole lot more with forged signatures on.
Of course.
But there is absolutely, there's very little about it. There's only one personal letter, which I quote in the book. So really we know nothing about him as a person or him as his family life, except he was married and he had one daughter. Then he had 3 daughters and 2 died in infancy here in the UK.
Yeah. No, so from what I read and obviously what I researched as well, obviously born over there in the UK, and then he attended a school there. Is it referred to as the King's School? Is that where he?
Yes, he did. The King's School in Gloucester,
okay,
which was basically a very ancient grammar school dating from the 14th century.
Wow. And he was married over there at, was it St. Peter's Church to Anne Bourne? That's where they got married?
Yes, because they got married in Wolverhampton. At that time, Button was working for Anne Bourne's father, who was a grocer, a trader of some type. And it is interesting that Anne Bourne, according to the local papers at the time, bought with us for the marriage a dowry of £10,000, which then was a lot of money.
Yeah.
And from the earliest time in business, Button always needed a lot of money, because he appeared to lose quite a lot but not make very much.
Yes, this is very true. Yeah, he's pretty unsuccessful in a lot of the different trades that he attempted.
He was a very successful politician, but he wasn't a very good businessman.
Yes, that's for sure. Now, there is kind of conflicting reports. I mean, obviously, I used your book as a very big source of mine, but I used other references as well. And, there's a few sources that say that when he immigrated here to America that he ended up right away in Savannah, Georgia. But then there's other accounts that say that he possibly ended up in Charleston, South Carolina. So from your research, is it definitely Savannah where he ended up at first, or was he in that South Carolina region and then went to Georgia?
Well, the papers which will tell you the answer to that are in your National Library in Washington. But as I understand it, as you would have read in the book, he learned his trade with the Americans when he was working for his uncles, trading in sugar and tobacco and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And he used to travel to the States. Well, I was there quite a lot, but he went across once or twice before he finally made the move. And it's quite likely he actually moved across north of South Carolina, then came down the coast. There is, I believe, some paperwork talking about Virginia.
Okay.
Certainly, he then went to South Carolina, and then, of course, he ended up in Savannah, Georgia, where he opened his first proper shop.
Interesting. So another interesting account, I believe it was actually a historical archaeologist that I found an article that's over here in the States. I believe he's somewhere in Georgia, this gentleman, said that the home on St. Catherine's Island here in Georgia, supposedly, obviously we know Button lived on St. Catherine's Island, but I guess there was a little bit of question whether or not the Tabby house was constructed by Button or whether he just kind of inherited that house and started living there. From your research, yeah.
Well, as I understand it, when as you know, he rented from Catherine's Island. He bought the lease.
Yes.
For £3,000, and with that came everything on it, which included the house. But the Tabby house, as you see it now, as I understand it, I visited it in 96 or 97, I think.
Okay.
In the Great Storm of 1899, 1900.
Okay.
The tsunami swamped the island and everything on it.
Oh, wow.
So what you see now is probably dates from that time or something maybe earlier. But the construction is very similar to what it would have been when Button was there, made of compressed oyster shells and whatever. And it's a very nice little house stuck in the middle of an island.
Yeah, it's interesting because St. Catherine's Island is not a very popular destination. Of course, a lot of people here in the States, if they're traveling to do any sort of holiday touristy type things, they usually end up in Savannah, Georgia, because that's a pretty popular place. But St. Catherine's Island is not something that's overly popular. And from what I read in the research I did, I don't know if you dove into this, but his wife, Ann Bourne, and maybe also his daughter are supposedly buried out there on the property in St. Catherine's Island. Did you see anything to indicate that in your research?
When we were there, as you know, Scoundrel Island is part of a foundation there, so
yes.
It's restricted access. There is a rumour there that he was buried on the island. I suspect his wife and daughter were buried in Charleston, because that's where they were when they died. But all the evidence points to the fact that Button was buried in Savannah, in the old colonial cemetery, somewhere in that cemetery.
Yes. We'll get.
I'm really quite sure.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And it really, if you look at the time, 1777, it would be highly unlikely that someone would, if he had been buried in the cemetery, would dig him up and take him across the island.
Interesting. So now, in your research, when Button did emigrate here to America and obviously settled here in Georgia, was there ever any indication that he went back over to the UK at any point, even for a visit or anything like that, or did he just stay here in America the entire time?
Not that I could find. I know that his wife came across once and then went back and then came back again. I found evidence of that. I had to find her name on a ship's manifest. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't find any evidence that Button actually travelled back to England once he got to Savannah. I think it's worth saying that once he did get to Savannah, he then became a secessionist, so he probably wouldn't have wanted to travel back.
Yes, this is true. He would have been considered a treasonist. Yes, that's true. So now, him and this relationship, of course, with Lachlan Mcintosh, that ended in a very bitter way, of course. What really, in your research, what would you say sparked this? I mean, outside of the denial, I know Button wanted, I guess, to be appointed in some sort of military job, and specifically, but obviously Lachlan Mcintosh was given the job instead. Was that what sparked this whole hatred between Button and Lachlan, or in your research, what do you think sparked all this?
Well, I think at the beginning, as you know, Button was the leader of his political party,
yes.
And when the policies that they always do started divvy out the jobs, the issue was that the party had no one of experience to do any of the jobs, so they put Button forward as the head of the militia.
Mm-hmm.
Despite the fact he had no military experience,
yeah.
as far as I can fathom whatsoever. And Lachlan Mcintosh was far more capable of the head of the militia, but he was in fact a serving army officer. But with that, along with that, there was also this, later on in time, that Button fell out with two of Lachlan's brothers.
Mm-hmm.
One had led the expedition on the first Blogger expedition, which had been forced to turn back because the Georgia government hadn't provided logistics or anything it would need to carry out its aid, which was secured at some port in Florida. And the other got locked up by Button when he was Secretary of State. In fact, quite legitimately, because the colonial government said that there should be no trading with the West Indies, and Lachlan's brother was trading with the West Indies, so Button and Secretary of State had no option to lock him up.
Yeah.
So not only did Button rub up Lachlan Mcintosh the wrong way, but he actually rubbed up the entire family the wrong way by blaming one for the failure of the expedition and locking the other one up.
Wow, it's interesting. Now, when the duel happened, and obviously both men were wounded in the duel, it was only a matter of a few days after the duel that Button obviously passed away, and it was mainly, from what I gather in your book, it was really mainly from infection, because there was just not the medical treatment at that time to treat wounds and injuries that he sustained during the duel. Is that correct?
That is, he had the problem, I suppose, on the class medically that found a battlefield wound. I mean, if you look at the size of the lead musket ball, or pistol that's going to hit him, I mean, it smashed the bone, we know that. Mm-hmm. It would have caused gangrene, and the only way to stop gangrene in those days was to cut more of the leg off, which
yes.
they did. But and the battlefield wounds didn't mend.
Yeah, it's incredible.
By the temperature and humidity in Georgia, hot and steamy, it wouldn't have aided the healing process.
Yes, yeah. Now, I saw in your book a picture of, I guess, the pistols that were used by Lachlan and Button. Are those the actual pistols that were used?
Those are the actual pistols, and they're in the Georgia Historical Library.
Oh, it's very interesting. So you got to obviously see those, and when you were doing your research.
Yep. And there's also bits of bone and some hair, but since no one knows what colour his hair was, the hair, without DNA testing, one wouldn't be able to know that was his. And the bones, the bits of bone came from when they disinterred the body and where they thought that he might have been buried, so it could be anybody's. Okay,
yeah, so now that leads me to my last point here with you. So, of course, the speculation about his burial site and the bones, obviously, that was exhumed in the, the late 50s, that body, the bones were exhumed, and I guess there was no DNA testing back then, so there's still speculation as to where the memorial monument is in that cemetery. We're not really sure if that's his bones underneath that memorial or not. Is that correct?
I think That's probably very right. And then the memorial came about because the state of Georgia wanted to commemorate the three signers. Among the other two are now, one's in Atlanta.
Lyman Hall and George Walton, yes. Yep.
Yeah. And so they knew where they were, so they put monuments on top of their graves. But since they didn't know where Button was, they put a monument where they thought he might be.
But, I mean, it's almost certain, since that was really the only cemetery in Savannah back in that day, it's almost certain that he is somewhere in that cemetery. Is that accurate?
Somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, you have to remember that in 1777, the English bombarded Savannah and probably bombarded the cemetery, and probably made a clean mess of it. So he could be anywhere, but he basically is in there somewhere.
Yeah, and of course, there's the record keeping back then was pretty poor, and like you said, when the British bombarded Savannah, I'm sure there was a lot of things that were destroyed, records and such, and everything else. So now, in all your research, the final thing I want to ask you is, do you think that Button kind of gets the short end of the stick here in the States? Because he really is. In all of my research about all of these individuals who signed the Declaration of Independence, he's probably the most obscure and least known signer of all 56 people. I mean, really, anytime I ever ask anybody here in the States, do you know who Button Gwinnett is? No one knows who he is. So
I think you're probably right. For the reasons we discussed earlier, the fact that there's nothing about it makes him obscure, and therefore gives him that figure of the man of mystery. I don't think there's any mystery about him. He was a competent politician. He had the gift of the gab. Would he have gone further if he hadn't been shot? I don't think so. I think by the time he was shot, he'd actually got to the end of his political tree. The conditions that got him to the leader of the party and basically the governor of Georgia were the same things that brought about his downfall. And I've never really understood why he challenged Lachlan Mcintosh to a duel with full knowledge of he's never going to win it.
Yeah.
Mcintosh was a professional soldier. Button had probably never touched a pistol in his life. Button always saw himself as a gentleman. Everyone else saw him as a ne'er-do-well or Johnny come lately. And certainly not a gentleman. And I think he thought that by challenging Mcintosh he would prove his worth as a gentleman. But the fact is, he couldn't back his thoughts up and ended up getting killed. Yeah.
Now, my last question I did want to ask you. So, based on, we really don't know what he looked like. So, is it fair to say that even the portraits that supposedly are of Button are could be fairly inaccurate, or we just really don't know?
Well, there are several. I'm just looking up now. There was one gentleman who described him and gave what he looked like. But when you actually look into his research, he was only 7 years old at the time, so he wasn't actually. One of the paintings was painted well after his death, and the other ones may well have been painted while he was in Georgia. But there's no record of the painter who painted it having ever gone to the States.
Wow. Interesting.
So the suspicion is that they were done probably from, not from memory, but from descriptions given by other people at the time.
Yeah.
But there doesn't appear to be any record of him actually sitting for portrait by either of those two painters.
Wow, that's incredible. So, I mean,
explains why they're different.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, this man is definitely a man of mystery and will continue to be. That's for sure. So.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I think I came across that description of someone writing in the 18th century. Man of mystery then, because no one knew really who he was, what he was like, and where he is now.
Wow, that's absolutely incredible. Well, Colin,
it is interesting. There's now in the Congress when he went to Philadelphia, there's no record of him ever speaking in any of the great debates about how the United States is going to come about.
Yeah.
There's one letter talking about he was on the Maritime Committee, and he did come home to Georgia with a bundle of money for the defense of the southern border. But there's no record of him taking a leading part in any of the debates on how the United States is going to be formed, or there were debates about independence.
Yeah.
And so I do find the whole thing really quite amazing.
Yeah, I mean, so he really just, I mean, he was a delegate to the Continental Congress, but he kind of was just off in the background from everything that you researched, right? I mean, he was just kind of present.
I think, I mean, my understanding was that you have to remember that at the time, Georgia's trade was in England.
Yeah.
The other counties that they were traded, from elsewhere, but Georgia, Savannah especially, its prosperity came from trade with England and the West Indies. And my understanding was that the three signers actually not so much signed the state of Georgia, but for their parishes.
Yes, yes.
So, it was against that background. I mean, there's one quite interesting bit. After the 6th of July, the 4th of July the 6th, Button was back in Savannah in the space of a couple of weeks. And since there was a war going on at the time between Philadelphia and Savannah, I'm not really quite sure how he got back quickly and be safely. Because if he did it on land, he would have avoided English troops, and if he did it by sea, there was a fairly effective blockade.
Yeah,
and he would have been a target.
Yeah, I remember reading that in your book. It's interesting because you said he definitely, obviously, was in Philadelphia up until early August when he signed the document, but then he was most certainly in Savannah later in the month of August. So, I mean, we're talking a matter of only 2 or 3 weeks or so that he must have gotten back to Savannah. So, like you said, it's interesting. I wonder how he did it.
Well, I do wonder how he did it, but I don't suppose he obviously rode a horse. Whether he was a fit horse or not, I don't know. But I mean, it's quite a long way from Philadelphia to Savannah.
Yeah.
Especially on horseback.
It's very, very interesting. Colin, it's fascinating. Your book is incredible. I will be telling all of my YouTube subscribers to go and take a look and purchase your book because it's fascinating. It's very fascinating. I think you did a wonderful job. I thank you so very much for all of your research and your time today with me. It's been absolutely incredible. I'm very, very thankful that you took the time out to do this because you sincerely are, sir. You're one of the only people that know a great deal about Button Gwinnett in the entire world, let alone here in the States, because like we said, he's just not a very well-known founding father.
It is interesting. But when I went down to Savannah in 96, I had a car, and I had to give all my forenames for the car.
Yeah.
And I said to them, my name is Gwinnett, and I got a free car.
Wow. They gave you.
Someone knew about it.
Somebody knew about it. There you go. Yeah. So it was name recognition. There you have it. I'm sure that as time goes on, that would happen even more obscure. I'm sure because, like I said, anybody. I'm 42 years old, so anybody my generation or younger. Nobody that I've ever spoke to here in the States has any idea about Button Gwinnett. So
I think it's right to say that there is no. I think I was told there are no family names of Gwinnett in the States.
Yeah.
I mean, you can always check that. I'm not going to check it, but it's one of those names which actually is unique.
Yeah, it is unique. Yes. Well, Colin, thank you so very much. I truly appreciate it. I will email you a link to my video once I put it up on YouTube so you can take a look. And again, thank you so very much for taking the time out to speak to me today. I really appreciate it.
Well, I hope I didn't interrupt your breakfast.
Oh, no, not at all. I've been up and I've been looking forward to our phone call, so I thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah, thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.
Okay, no problem.
You have a wonderful day.
Yeah. Thanks very much, sir.
All right, bye-bye now. Thank you again, sir.